Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar about chemical safety, in particular discussion about OSHA and EPA's regulatory schemes intended to protect against explosions and chemical exposures. In particular, we're going to be talking today about OSHA's Process Safety Management Standard and the current enforcement landscape as it relates to process safety management. The Environmental Protection Agency's Risk Management Plan Rule, which is a sister regulation to OSHA's PSM standard, and then a relatively new development, OSHA's request for information and plans for modifying or trying to find a way to modify the health regulatory or health exposure, chemical exposure standards that are on the books now and for chemicals for which there's no regulation at this point. And so in this sense, we are talking about chemical safety in general, and we look forward to getting into an interesting discussion. A few logistical items up front. We will make the slides from today's event available to anybody who's interested, and maybe even if you're not interested, you'll probably get a copy emailed to you after this event. We are also recording the webinar event, and we'll make a link available to the recording probably on our website, and also can email that around if you're interested in that. One last sort of housekeeping item is that to eliminate background noise during the presentation, we have muted all of the lines. So what we are doing is we have a little chat, a written chat session open. You probably see on the bottom left of your screen a note from me that lays out a lot of what I'm talking about now. But if you have questions or input to offer during the event, please type that into the chat. I think there's an option where you can have everyone see it, or at least have the presenter see it. And we will field questions that way and repeat the question and address them as we go along. If we're not able to get to your question during the webinar today, this program captures all of those written questions, and we will be sure to respond to any questions we don't get to by email or by a return phone call. With all that being said, let's get started with the webinar. Let me introduce this faceless voice that you're listening to right now. I recognize a lot of your names, so hopefully most or all of you know who I am. I'm Eric Conn. I'm the chair of the OSHA Workplace Safety Practice Group at Conn Maciel Carey. And for many of you that I haven't talked to in a little while, that's a new banner that's waving behind me, a different law firm that we just started a little less than 3 months ago. We're very proud of what we've got going here, and so pleased that you all could join us today for one of our very first webinar events here at the new firm. The new firm, Conn Maciel Carey, is a small boutique law firm focused on OSHA, workplace safety, and employment and labor legal issues. We have a deep bench of OSHA specialists, one of the major focuses here at the new law firm. My practice in particular, I focus on OSHA and a handful of those alphabet soup agencies that have jurisdiction over safety and health, and in some instances environmental issues, most often environmental issues in the context of this chemical safety arena where it overlaps with OSHA as well. I work with clients to manage investigations and inspections of catastrophic and other industrial accidents really across all industries and across the entire country. One of the nice things about our new firm here, we do have this deep bench of lawyers. We've practiced pretty much in all 4 corners of the country, and we do have a Cal OSHA specialist as well out in San Francisco. Another part of my practice is helping employers develop, implement, audit, and improve safety and health programs, and we do speak and write regularly on OSHA regulatory issues. So I'm going to let my colleague, Kate McMahon, who's joining me for this webinar, introduce herself real quick, and then we'll let you know what our topics will be.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very good to talk to you. I'm very excited to talk with Eric and you all this afternoon about chemical safety in the workplace. We have kind of a broad spectrum of topics to discuss here, generally related by the theme of chemical safety. And I'm going to focus in particular on OSHA's recent, what I think is fascinating development, what they are calling national dialogue that they are commencing to discuss how to more effectively regulate chemicals in the workplace and how to help employers manage their chemicals that they store, use, and produce in the workplace. Talk about that towards the end of the program. Without further ado, why don't I turn it over to Eric, and he's going to begin by talking about some enforcement issues.
All right, so digging in. Our agenda for today, we're going to cover OSHA's Process Safety Management National Emphasis Programs, and they have active national emphasis programs targeting chemical manufacturing facilities, chemical storage facilities, and petroleum refineries. And they had a phase 1 of petroleum refinery emphasis program inspections in which every refinery in the country was visited, and now I'm hearing that they are back for follow-up inspections. So whether there's a formal emphasis program active for refineries, I'm not entirely sure, but I know that refineries are being visited again under the same model that we were visited for in the last go-round. We're also going to talk a little bit about President Obama's Executive Order 13650, which was entitled Improving Chemical Facility Safety and Security, issued last year in the wake of some very serious incidents at chemical manufacturing facilities, and talk about what impact that has both on the regulatory scheme, enforcement, as well as rulemaking. And then specifically in that regard, talk about requests for information that both OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency issued, which introduce or really forecast some potential changes we might anticipate in terms of the Process Safety Management Standard and the Risk Management Plan Rule. And then as a final talking point for today, a very interesting review of this national dialogue that Kate just mentioned in terms of some possible chemical rulemaking to address the current permissible exposure limits for existing chemical exposure standards, and then a way to pull in some exposure regulation for chemicals that there is not an existing regulation for at the moment. So that'll be an interesting discussion there. Digging right into the National Emphasis Program discussion. I'll give a little background here, and we're going back a few years to the Petroleum Refinery National Emphasis Program focused on process safety management. Back in 2007, this was launched, and within about 3 or 4 years, 100% of the nation's refineries were visited for a comprehensive, resource-intensive inspection, reviewing primarily compliance with OSHA's Process Safety Management Standard, but also sweeping in other regulatory requirements that relate to management of highly hazardous chemicals. These were, as I say, resource-intensive inspections. We saw an average OSHA man-hours of about 40 man-hours on average per inspection, which is dramatically higher than the sort of typical average for an OSHA inspection. What we were seeing were teams of inspectors, your industrial hygiene specialists, your process safety management specialists, your safety specialists, teams coming on site and spending several days, sometimes even more than a week, engaged in a very thorough inspection at each of the nation's refineries. The average cumulative penalty that came out of the first wave of the Refinery NEP inspections was more than $75,000 per inspection. And the average penalty per violation was approaching $7,000, which, as you know, is the maximum penalty per violation for a serious violation. The actual average per serious violation across the country, across any type of inspection, is about $2,100, $2,200 per serious violation. So here we were seeing either a significant number of repeat and willful violations, which carry 10 times higher penalties, or most likely the penalties that were issued here per serious violation were approaching the maximum that could be assigned to a violation. And generally, you see the lower penalties, the $2,000, $3,000 per violation, for smaller employers, less hazardous, violations related to less hazardous activities than petroleum refining and chemical manufacturing. So here we were seeing high average per penalty violations and an average violations per inspection of more than 10, which is also significantly higher than the national average and the average across other types of inspections. So these were in-depth, comprehensive, and catching lots of violations. Here's a little breakdown of what the violation categories within the PSM standard itself that we were seeing cited most often in the Refinery NEP. Now this doesn't include, there are of course, hazard communication standard was cited quite often, lockout tagout standard was cited quite often, and other non-PSM standards were cited. But among PSM itself, which obviously was the most frequently cited of all the standards because it was an emphasis on PSM, but these were the sub-elements of the PSM standard that were most frequently cited. And sitting right at the top at about 20% of each inspection, 20% of the total violations issued under the program were mechanical integrity related. And we'll talk about in the chemical facilities NEP a breakdown within that category of what specifically OSHA was finding and citing in terms of mechanical integrity. Process safety information was the next big category of violations there. This is your collection of data and information regarding the process, the chemicals in the process, the equipment in the process, your safe operating limits, intended inventories, codes and design standards to which equipment and the process was designed. That collection was cited quite often as well. After that, we saw operating procedures and process hazard analysis elements as the next highest cited categories within the PSM standard, and you can see so on down the list of the next frequently cited sub-elements. The takeaways from the Refinery NEP, and they're sort of different depending on your perspective. OSHA's takeaways, which they've announced in various speeches and talking points that came out of the Refinery NEP, they talked about their list-based approach, that it was effective. They liked that. They had not implemented that form of inspection in many programs before this, and they found it to be effective. And what they mean here is identifying a list of topics they're going to explore and drill down into, and generally it was the major elements of the PSM standard. And within each topic, there was itself a list of questions, and in the Refinery NEP, interestingly, those were shared with the refineries in advance, not so for the chemical facilities NEP, but in any event, a list of questions that they're going to explore, and then down below that, a list of documents and information to be collected as part of the inspection process. It was very structured. It was very pre-planned. And one of OSHA's takeaways from this NEP is that was an effective way to conduct an emphasis program and to conduct inspections under an emphasis program. The other thing that OSHA found effective was training of their compliance officers. And as probably everyone on this call, if you're here because you operate facilities or operate processes covered by the PSM standard, you know how complex it is, how complicated it is, how unique each process is, and each element of the standard complying with it can be very complicated. There's not many folks within OSHA, frankly, that understand it or understand it well enough to really do a comprehensive inspection like this. So before the NEP launched, OSHA engaged in substantial training of their internal resources and found that training, OSHA found, was effective in developing a new team of compliance officers capable of really evaluating process safety management programs within the refineries that they were inspecting. The other big takeaway was that OSHA's focus on REGA-GAP, recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices, revealed many deficiencies. Really, this is OSHA's way of going beyond their written regulation and saying there's all these industry codes out there, there's all these consensus standards, And OSHA's expectation is that refineries and chemical manufacturers are going to be operating essentially in compliance with all of these non-mandatory consensus standards and codes. And with that mindset, they set about to find non-compliances with these non-mandatory codes, and they found quite a few of them. And, remembering that mechanical integrity sat at the top of the list of most frequently cited standards, it was this issue that employers were not following Reg-A-Gap in terms of inspection frequencies, or inspection procedures, or maintenance procedures. And that's really what we were seeing cited most often in the refinery NEP, and obviously, well, not obviously, but we'll talk about it, that carried over into the chemical facilities NEP as well, and we'll talk about some of the issues that OSHA is finding in that regard. Another big takeaway that OSHA talked about, I guess they expressed a little bit of surprise about, was that refineries still have, in OSHA's estimation, some significant facility siting issues. And they say still have because there were some relatively marquee incidents, very significant incidents that implicated facility siting issues, control rooms, break rooms, and other areas where employees might congregate that were in the blast zone in areas that could be significantly impacted by a PSM incident. And despite those very high-profile incidents and some major enforcement actions in the multi-million-dollar range enforcement actions, despite all that, OSHA was still finding issues with facility siting during these refinery NEPs and wanted to make a big deal out of that. This is sort of this list of takeaways I've been able to cobble together from presentations I've seen folks at OSHA give and some things I've seen written publicly by OSHA. But one of the things that I have not seen, which I think is kind of interesting, I'm not sure what the backstory is that OSHA was talking about a white paper or some kind of detailed analysis about the refinery NEP like 3 years ago. And they were talking about how it was just about done, ready to be released, ready to be issued, and we've never seen that. And it's curious that hasn't happened. And I'm not sure why we haven't seen that, but I've been waiting for it because I think it would be very informative for this new wave of inspections that refineries we're seeing now, and informative to chemical manufacturers who operate, under the same standard. We were looking for this sort of detailed analysis and still have never seen it. So I've done a little bit of my own analysis and sort of the industry's takeaways. These are my takeaways from the refinery NEP and a little bit of what we're learning from the chemical PSM NEP as well. And one of my takeaways is that a single issue, one valve replacement, one mechanical integrity activity can result in multiple citations. And we saw this very often. When you saw this 10 or 11 citation items per average, maybe half of those related to a single item, a single change, a single incident. And what we would see is someone would make a valve replacement, and that might trigger a violation for management of change, not doing an adequate management of change for it, not updating your process safety information collection based on a new valve or new materials of construction. If the valve requires a change in your standard operating procedure, not seeing an update in the procedure, and then likewise, therefore, not providing training, required training to your employees. So one activity, one event leading to multiple violations, all of the same activity. That was one of the big takeaways of the NEP. The other is sort of a slightly modified version of OSHA's view of Reg-A-Gap is that Reg-A-Gap is basically being enforced as the law. OSHA, without going through rulemaking, has just found a way to treat industry consensus standards as mandatory. So it's important that you understand what consensus standards you are relying on and that you're complying with it, because if you identify it as the basis for your mechanical integrity program or other elements of the PSM standard, OSHA is going to hold you to the terms of that Reg-A-Gap as though it is the law. So understand that and make sure you analyze your programs accordingly. Likewise, OSHA is treating employers' own procedures and own written policies and programs as mandatory. And that, I think, is a little bit less of a stretch because the PSM standard is what's called a performance-based regulation, performance-based standard, which means OSHA is not going to prescribe how you do it, but they're going to tell you what the goal is, what the performance objective is, and then you are required to implement a program and policies and procedures to drive compliance with that objective. And so when you develop those procedures, you develop your mechanical integrity procedures, OSHA is then going to hold you to that and say, you've identified how you will meet the performance objective, and that procedure you've just introduced is now the law, and they will enforce it as mandatory. So if you're not complying with Reg AGEP in the previous bullet or your own internal programs, policies, or procedures, that's going to be a violation of the PSM standard. And then the other thing we've seen or we saw through this refinery NEP is a demand for more documentation and a demand for more proof of implementation. You know, it used to be that these types of inspection programs were really paperwork oriented, and OSHA would look at the paperwork and stop there. Now they're really looking a little bit deeper into implementation. Okay, you've got a good written program, now show me in the field how it's being implemented. And so to establish that, they're looking for more documentation that shows that you're actually implementing it, and also doing some field checks out in the field as well. So that took us into the Chemical Facilities National Emphasis Program, which began in 2009 only as a pilot program. And this was OSHA sort of taking the learnings from the Refinery NEP and saying, let's get out into the thousands and thousands more chemical manufacturing facilities than we have petroleum refineries in the country, and see if these issues that we've identified at the refineries are systemic. Started off with just as a pilot program in 3 regions, Region 1, Region 7, and Region 10. States were encouraged but not required to participate. The pilot program was extended several times, but it remained just in those 3 regions, though extended. I think it started off as a 1-year program, extended at least twice as 1-year programs in those 3 regions. And here's what we saw from the pilot chemical facilities PSM NEP. A number of inspections, approaching 300 inspections under the pilot. Many of them were unprogrammed. And that might seem sort of peculiar that this is a national emphasis program. It is by design a programmed inspection, but yet almost half of the inspections done under the NEP were not programmed. That's because if OSHA has another reason to visit your facility, an incident, an employee complaint, a media referral, an emergency response referral, if they're there on one of those occasions, and they discover that that facility is covered by the PSM standard, is otherwise covered by the NEP, they can expand the inspection for whatever reason brought them there into a full national emphasis program inspection. And many of the inspections that were done under this pilot were initiated by incidents, employee complaints, and referrals. 173 of those 259 inspections yielded citations. That actually seems like, boy, there was an awful lot of in-compliance inspections. Obviously most found citations. But if you look back up at the first sub-bullet, 30 of these inspections, when OSHA showed up, discovered that the PSM standard didn't apply. Either the facility was shut down or they didn't have a covered process. So those inspections didn't proceed. So we're really talking about 173 out of about 230 inspections resulted in citations. We saw about 8.5 citations per inspection, a little bit less than the PSM NEP, but not much less. And one thing I can tell you about this program is it was much less intensive than the Refinery NEP, but came up with fairly close in number inspections per citations per inspection. Great many different standards were being cited, over 70 different standards. That includes the subparts of PSM, but also many of the other standards in OSHA's catalog. The average proposed penalty per inspection was $31,000. That was down. What did we see before in the Refinery NEP was about $76,000. So quite a bit down in terms of total penalty. which you might expect for a less comprehensive inspection. 40% of the citations were non-PSM. That was quite a bit more, actually, than the rate of PSM inspections under the Refinery NEP. There's some differences there, but the commonality, if you look at the most frequently cited standards or most frequently cited PSM substandards, they are the same. I think the order, I think it's actually exactly the same. So that was a significant takeaway from the Refinery NEP, showed you where OSHA was focused and where they were leaning, and in fact they found the same types of issues, at least at the top, in the same order. Mechanical integrity still carries the day as the most frequently cited. Collection of process safety information, your PHAs and your operating procedures are the major categories. Management of change came in fifth in both the refinery and the chemical facility NEP. Broken down a little bit more detail, this shows you precisely which sub-element of those major categories were being cited. And what's interesting is we're talking about the mechanical integrity, right? It was the mechanical integrity was the most oft-cited item, but really that was made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 different substandards. Really, the individual sub-item that was most cited was documenting compliance with Reg A-Gap, which is not a mechanical integrity element, it's a PSI element. That was the single boiled down substandard sub-element within the PSM standard that was cited more than any, really almost twice as much as most of the other categories. You've got your written mechanical integrity procedures on mechanical integrity and documenting compliance with Reg A-Gap, the two by far most cited standards and sub-elements within the PSM standard. So the pilot, served its purpose. Here's David Michaels, the director of the agency, saying, during our pilot chemical NEP, we found many of the same safety-related problems that we uncovered during our national emphasis program for the refining industry. As a result, we are expanding the enforcement program to a national level to increase awareness of these dangers so that employers will more effectively prevent the release of highly hazardous chemicals. I think we would have been hard-pressed to see a scenario where OSHA didn't find a way for the pilot program to confirm what they knew going in, is that there were substantial non-compliances at chemical manufacturing facilities. So this was not a surprise that that OSHA concluded anyway that the NEP, the pilot NEP, gave them grounds to expand, and so they've expanded. So let's talk about the nationwide expansion of the process safety management NEP for chemical facilities. Under this NEP, OSHA has conducted and is continuing to conduct focused inspections at facilities, so-called randomly selected from a list of work sites likely to have a PSM covered process. Inspections include detailed questions on PSM requirements and verification that the written PSM program elements are being implemented. So they're doing this like the PSM NEP on a list-based inspection program. It's different in that the list is not shared with the chemical facilities in advance, and there are a couple other differences that we'll talk about here. One important one is that it's active now, and there's no expiration date. So this, if you are operating a chemical manufacturing facility or any facility that has a covered process, we see this often non-chemical manufacturers, but you have, an ammonia refrigeration system. You're covered by this program, and you're on a list out there likely to be inspected. So it's active. There doesn't appear to be any expiration date in the program. The new program expands the pilot NEP nationwide. So it's not just those 3 regions, and the states, which were previously encouraged but not required, are now required to participate. Everywhere in the country, there is an active chemical facilities PSM NEP right now. The inspection scheduling expectations, each area office is expected to complete at least 3 to 5 programmed inspections per year. We're seeing a great deal more than 3 to 5 per area office because of all of the unprogrammed inspections. And what's happening is If you have a facility that has a covered process and OSHA is there for any reason, they are doing inspections under this chemical NEP while they're there. So we're seeing quite a few more than 5 inspections per area office, not per region, per area office each year. The inspection targets, how OSHA is selecting the facilities that they're going to inspect. They've created a master list for each region based on RMP submissions to EPA. If you are a program level 3 RMP submission, that your name has been dumped onto this master list for the chemical NEP for OSHA. If you have a NAICS code under the explosive manufacturing category, you're on this list. If you appear in OSHA's enforcement database because you have had previous PSM violations, you are on this list and likely to be inspected under the NEP program. And then if you are otherwise known to operate a PSM covered process. And one of the things we're seeing that's kind of interesting is that OSHA is doing web research. They're looking at your website online to understand your operations and what business you're in. If you're in their region, they see your sign driving to work or out while they're doing other inspections, they're going to look and say, what does this company do? And if it looks like you are in the chemical business, you are on this NEP list and subject to inspection under this program. Some other key elements of the nationwide chemical NEP is that OSHA is selecting the units for inspection based on an analysis that they've described in the directive for the program. And the analysis is to identify the most hazardous processes at each of these facilities. And they make that determination based on quantity of chemicals in the process, the numbers of workers or contractors who are present in those units, incident near-miss reports and other history. So a lot of what you see is OSHA may show up, start the inspection with a very broad net and pull in, we want to see your incident reports and near-miss reports across the entire facility, and then use that information to steer them ultimately to select 1 or 2 or 3 process units to conduct a more drilled down list-based inspection. So they're using that data from the first day or 2 of the inspection to target the rest of the inspection. If you have a union at your workplace or an organized group of operators or employees, they are going to have private meetings with them and get some input from them about which units they ought to be inspecting. They are using in their calculus for most hazardous processes age of the process units, maintenance activities, ongoing maintenance activities. If you've got problem areas that need more work than other areas, they're going to look at that and see if they're being adequately addressed from a mechanical integrity standpoint, whether your PHA has identified any unique hazards or unique issues because of ongoing maintenance issues. And then they're going to be looking at your 1910-119.0 PSM compliance audit, and that might inform them about certain units they ought to spend a little more time looking at. This NEP, part of their lessons learned from the refinery NEP is that they should focus on implementation over documentation. You might have a great PSM program all neat and tidy in a binder, but it's not being implemented in the field. And that's what these inspections are about, is getting out and really evaluating compliance in the field with your PSM procedures and with RegAGAP. And then finally, or not finally, I go with a few more of these, the dynamic list-based evaluation, whereas there was a static list-based evaluation in the refinery NEP. For the chemical NEP, it's a dynamic list, a list of rotating questions, a list of rotating topics that they're going to dig into. And the reason why it's rotating is because they're looking at fewer than the refinery NEP. The refinery NEP really was exhaustive. They really looked at all of the elements of the PSM standard in doing their evaluation. In the chemical NEP, there's this rotating list that has them focus on a subset of the elements of the PSM standard as they dig in to do these inspections. So obviously, they can expand it if they feel like there are systemic problems or wholesale problems with the program, but this is how they're starting the review of your program. The last few items of things you need to know about the chemical NEP, just like the refinery NEP, a single issue yields multiple violations. The same discussion we had before. we're seeing that carried through in the chemical manufacturing facilities as well. Abatement verification and documentation is mandatory. OSHA is looking at past PSM citations issued to the same employer going back 6 years, which is different than the standard for identifying repeat violations. They're looking back 6 years to find any past PSM citations, and part of their directive is that they must evaluate those past issues to see whether you've corrected them and maintained a correction of those issues. Are you operating, have you fallen back, or did you never correct those issues? So that's one of the things you can know, that if you've ever had a past PSM violation and OSHA's there under this NEP, they will be reevaluating the status of compliance with that issue. And then the last thing that is fairly interesting about this emphasis program is that the directive itself really lays out the list of questions, the list of documents that OSHA is going to request from you, and a list of presentations they may ask you to make during the inspection as well. And that's a really good idea, is to, if you've not done this before, go pull the directive off OSHA's website or send me an email. I'm happy to send it to you, and look at what OSHA is going to ask for, what they're going to look at, and what they're going to ask you to describe for them when they start one of these inspections. And then do it yourself. You can do practically the same audit that OSHA is going to do with the guidance they provide in the directive, and see how you stack up against the standard and against the type of inspection they're going to do. A great idea for how to prepare for this type of inspection. So that's what we've got in terms of the chemical facilities and refinery national emphasis program. That's sort of the focus of this presentation on the enforcement side of the house. The rest of the presentation is really about rulemaking activities, and really some very preliminary rulemaking activities. So let's talk a little bit about, first, the executive order, President Obama's executive order 13650 for improving chemical facility safety and security. This executive order was issued back in August of last year, and it was issued generally in response to the West fertilizer explosion, but also a series of other pretty high-profile catastrophic incidents at chemical facilities. And President Obama said, you know, we keep having too many of these really high-profile, really nasty incidents. We need to improve the situation. So I'm ordering this group of alphabet soup agencies to get together, form a committee, and come up with, you know, ideas for how we can improve chemical safety and security for facilities that store and manufacture chemicals. And so they established what was called the Chemical Facility Safety and Security Working Group, that was made up of representatives from OSHA, EPA, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, the USDA, and the Department of Transportation. That group got together over the last year and a half or so, and relatively recent, well, talk about what their mission was. The mission of this group was to improve operational coordination and information sharing between federal government and state agencies, between emergency responders, between communities, and between establishments that manufacture and store chemicals. That was the directive, the goal of this working group. Other stated goals of the group were to modernize policies, regulations, and standards, and to identify best practices that will drive a reduction in safety and security risks at these fixed chemical facilities. The group had met several times, put together several initiatives, and were engaged in several actions independently and collectively, and relatively recently, earlier this summer, reported back to the President the status of progress towards those goals. And they put together a report that they shared with the President, and the report identified, you know, quite a few actions, quite a few status updates. The most important 5 that I identified in the report were, you know, their efforts to enhance community planning and preparedness, their efforts to improve federal operational coordination, efforts to develop and consolidate data management, and ways to integrate stakeholder feedback and fostering best practices. And then the last one, which I've got highlighted in big red letters here, is their effort to modernize regulations and policies. That is what I think the most significant activity we've seen this group undertake, and we're going to talk a little bit about what they're doing, how they're engaging in this effort to modernize regulations, and what that might mean for chemical manufacturers and petroleum refiners. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Kate at this point to talk a little bit about the status of these rulemaking efforts.
Thanks, everyone. So, as Eric just described, we had an executive order that asked this working group and its members to look at ways to modernize chemical regulation to improve security. As a result of that executive order, 2 requests for information were issued by OSHA and by EPA. OSHA issued theirs in December of 2013. It is an RFI asking for how to improve the process safety management standard in order to ensure security at our chemical facilities. Similarly, in July of 2014, EPA issued an almost identical request for information asking about how the RMP, how the risk management program could be expanded to improve security and chemical safety. We don't have time in this hour to run through the details of what OSHA and EPA are looking at, but I want to at least highlight a few of the most important from our perspective. OSHA is outlined in their RFI various topics on which it asks stakeholders to comment. I've listed here in this slide that's in front of you the top 10 possible revisions to the PSM standards. The questions they ask are going to clue us in areas where they may revise the standard. So let's just run through a couple of the most important. OSHA asked about the elimination of the atmospheric storage tank exemption. As you may know, those of you who deal with PSM know, under the standard, flammables stored in atmospheric storage tanks under certain select situations are exempt. But the OSHA Review Commission issued a decision in 1997 that considerably expanded that atmospheric storage tank exemption to cover flammables stored in storage tanks, even if they are connected to a process that is covered by PSM. That is not what OSHA initially or originally intended, according to the agency, by that exemption. And so the agency is asking for comment on closing that gap that was created by the Muir decision in 1997. Coverage for reactivity hazards. As you know, if you deal with this standard, a number of reactive chemicals are listed in the listed chemicals, but wholesale reactive hazards are not covered. OSHA is asking for comment on whether to cover reactivity chemicals that are reactive wholesale, essentially, in the standard. So expanding the standard considerably to cover reactive chemical hazards. Updating the list. Obviously, the list Appendix A is the list of chemicals covered, written in 1992. Hasn't been updated since. OSHA is asking for what additional chemicals ought to be added to the list. We could run through these. I think maybe what we'll do is, if people have questions about the various revisions that OSHA is considering or EPA is considering to the RMP, why don't you send in some notes, and we'll have time towards the end of the program to talk more specifically about the possible revisions. But in the interest of time, why don't we move on to, I'm going to move through these slides. If you know, I've noted various revisions that EPA is considering to the RMP. Those are listed there in your slides. I'm not going to run through them. They're nearly identical to what OSHA is considering. So you know, the rulemaking the docket has closed on both of these RFIs. Docket closed in March on the OSHA PSM RFI, and just recently at the end of October on the RMP, EPA's RMP. Interestingly, OSHA received 103 comments. The EPA RMP RFI received nearly 600 comments. Looking at the docket, it looks as if about 2/3 of the commenters for EPA's RMP anyway were environmental groups or individuals. It does not look like there was a lot of industry comment that was submitted, or at least it was heavily outweighed by people from the other side of the aisle. So I haven't looked specifically at OSHA's PSM comments, but I would imagine that it's similar makeup. So it may be that the comments that are in the docket will encourage OSHA to move forward in making some of these revisions. We'll have to wait and see. What happens here will be dictated in large measure by what happens in the next presidential election. Okay, so why don't we move on to talk about OSHA's chemical management and PEL's rule RFI. In October of this year, OSHA issued a request for information asking stakeholders to talk to the agency, provide comment, engage in discussion, engage in a, quote, national dialogue, if you will, about how to revamp chemical regulations in this country to provide more security to employees who work with chemicals in their workplaces every day. It happened because the agency recognized essentially the colossal failure of the PEL program, which is the centerpiece of OSHA's, traditionally has been the centerpiece of how OSHA regulates chemicals in the workplace. Single regulation chemical PELs are set. PELs are permissible exposure limits, dictating the highest level of exposure that a worker can experience at a workplace. In the United States, EPA has, I think, about 85,000 chemicals, 87,000 chemicals listed in the TSCA inventory database. ACC, the American Chemistry Council, has estimated that there are somewhere around 8,500 to 10,000 chemicals in workplaces currently in the U.S. every day that workers are exposed to. So we have about 10,000 chemicals in workplaces in the U.S. OSHA has set 29 comprehensive occupational health standards since the agency was formed in 1971. They have set only one comprehensive standard since 2000, and that was for hexavalent chromium. They have less than 500 permissible exposure limits. Now, these are limits that are in Table Z, OSHA's 1910-1000 Table Z limits. They are not comprehensive occupational health standards. They include only the PEL, or a ceiling concentration limit, and not the ancillary provisions that are included in the 29 occupational standards. Of the 500 PELs in Table Z, the large majority of those PELs are more than 40 years old. They are based on ANSI or ACGIH standards that were set by the department. They were brought over when OSHA was established, when the OSHA Act passed in the early 70s. OSHA, under Section 6A of the Act, had 2 years to adopt national consensus standards into regulation. It engaged in rulemaking activity under 6A, adopting those on nearly all of the PELs that you see in Table Z today. Those were adopted as from national consensus standards, which included really two sources, some ANSI standards and some ACGIH standards, both of which were from the 1940s to the late 60s. So they're based on relatively old scientific data, and OSHA, labor, and industry recognize that those standards by and large are antiquated standards. In an attempt to fix the problem, in 1989, OSHA proposed to revise en masse, essentially, 350 of the Table Z limits. They did an analysis of the feasibility of those of those standards. They did an analysis of the risk associated with exposure to those chemicals. But ultimately, that rule was finalized and then challenged by both labor as well as industry. The rule went to the 11th Circuit. The litigation was in the 11th Circuit, and ultimately the 11th Circuit vacated the standard and remanded it to the agency. The agency did not take further action. The case is called the air contaminants case, and it was a huge loss for OSHA and a huge loss in the agency's effort to make significant progress in updating their chemical standards. Since that loss, since the air contaminants case, OSHA has sort of slogged away trying to develop individual single occupational standards, and as I said at the outset, they've only adopted one new standard since 2000. On average, it's taking the agency about 12 to 16 years to develop and finalize a chemical standard. So, Dr. Michaels and the agency recognize that the system is broken. And it seems as if this RFI that was issued in October is the agency's attempt to do something about it. Dr. Michaels said in October 2013, the complexity of OSHA's current rulemaking process makes it extremely difficult for us to update our chemical standards and to issue new standards in a reasonable period of time. I would say, and he would probably agree, that that is the understatement of the year by Dr. Michaels. There's been a huge failure on the part of the agency, and the failure results from really, I think, the obstacles that OSHA has to get around or surmount in developing rules. And I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about some of the more obvious obstacles that under the OSHA Act and case law that has developed under the Act, OSHA is required to develop a standard only where it can demonstrate that there is significant risk of material impairment of health or bodily function. In 1980, in a case referred to as the benzene case, which was a challenge by industry to the benzene standards that OSHA had set a couple of years prior to that, the Supreme Court looked at the question of risk and when OSHA could, under the statute, develop a standard to protect workers from exposures to chemicals. The court said, the Berger court said, that the agency could not develop a standard unless they could demonstrate that there was significant risk. They defined significant risk, the court defined significant risk as at a 1 in 1,000 chance of a worker dying as a result of exposure to that chemical or experiencing material impairment of health over a 45-year working life. So that resulted in the agency beginning to do detailed quantitative risk analyses to determine whether there is a 1 in 1,000 chance of a worker experiencing material impairment if he is exposed to the chemical over a 45-year working life. That case does not define 1 in 1,000 as the base, but it at least is instructive as to what the courts will support for significant risk. In addition, the statute under Section 3.8 requires a rulemaking to be done only where it is reasonably necessary and appropriate. There's case law defining what reasonably necessary and appropriate means. I won't go into that, but it increases the burden on the agency to demonstrate that there is a true need for a rulemaking and a true risk before they can engage in rulemaking. On the feasibility side, Section 6B of the statute does not allow the agency to develop a rule that is not feasible to comply with. Feasibility includes both technical feasibility as well as economic feasibility. There's been all kinds of case law to define what is technical and what is economic feasibility. Under the statute, basically, and the case law that interprets the statute, basically, a standard will be determined to be technically feasible if a typical firm or establishment will be able to develop or install engineering and work practice controls that can meet the PEL in most operations. Economic feasibility is determined to be, or a standard is determined to be economically feasible if it will not threaten the long-term profitability of an industry or substantially alter the competitive structure of an industry. So they're low standards for feasibility, but they're there nevertheless. It isn't so much that OSHA can't meet those standards. They can and often do, but what they have to do in order to meet those standards is they have to spend an awful lot of resources and an awful lot of time developing, modeling, and constructing reasonable estimates of cost, reasonable estimates of achievable controls that can exposure reductions that can be achieved with various types of technology. That process takes a lot of time and slows the agency down, really bogging them down in developing support for the rule. Finally, the burden of proof that has been established is higher than arbitrary and capricious. It's not, it doesn't certainly require scientific certainty, but it does require substantial evidence in the record, which means that the agency has to prove up why it is supporting and promulgating or proposing to promulgate the standard that it has rather than competing standards. And the agency is required to demonstrate why it is that they are rejecting alternatives. That, too, takes an awful long time. So, between those statutory and case law requirements, the agency has developed a process that takes years and years to complete. In fact, the agency's own rulemaking process description has them taking between 4 and 12 years to develop a rule. I will tell you, having been involved in numerous of the rulemakings that OSHA has engaged in, only one successfully, 4 years is not achievable. It typically, as I said earlier, takes 12 to 16 years to develop a rule. The final point I want to make is that OSHA also does have, I'll refer to them kindly as resource issues. This is a man who is walking and chewing gum at the same time. As my friends on the other side of the aisle and some even within the agency have noted for me, OSHA has difficulty engaging in these activities at the same time, and certainly has difficulty developing more than one rule at a time. So the agency is really not multitasking on the rulemaking side. On the enforcement side, it's obviously a very, very different story. But on the rulemaking side, they tend to stick with one rule, don't have enough resources to engage in multiple rulemakings, and therefore we're stuck with a situation that just doesn't work. So they have developed this request for information that they issued on October 9th in order to open a dialogue to ask industry and citizens groups, employee representatives, stakeholders to comment on how to improve the system. My view, having been involved in chemical rulemaking for some time now with the agency in on various rules, that the agency is being open, honest, and sincere here in reaching out to the regulated community to ask how they can improve. They are looking generally at two big areas of improvement. how to fix the PEL process. Is there a way to develop PELs in a shorter, more efficient manner? And two, they're looking beyond the PEL process at alternatives to chemical management without relying on the establishment of specific single chemical permissible exposure limits. Talk for a minute or two about the first category that OSHA is looking at, how to get around the problems that have developed with establishing permissible exposure limits. They are looking at the question of streamlining the PEL setting process. One of the areas they're considering is avoiding the traditional feasibility analysis that really takes an awful long time, costs a lot of money because the OSHA engages contractors to develop specific control analyses for different work operations and processes that will be impacted by the PEL that is being considered. OSHA is required by law, at least there are a number of circuits that have determined that OSHA has to do an industry-by-industry analysis. So they can't make a determination of feasibility broadly across the industry spectrum. They've got to look at each industry, under the current setting anyway, they've got to look at each industry and do a feasibility analysis. So the agency is considering the concept of modeling feasibility rather than measuring feasibility. Currently, they do measuring. They go out, they do site visits, they engage in exposure analysis to determine what current exposures are occurring. They then look at control technologies. They make estimates of what reductions can be made, and they apply those to the exposure values that they've identified through these site visits and through database mining. Their enforcement database, they've got a lot of exposure data. OSHA is considering the concept of modeling feasibility. It's an interesting concept. We don't know too much about what they're considering. The RFI does go into some detail about a couple of different ways that they might avoid the traditional feasibility analysis. Same sort of analysis they're doing on the risk assessment side. The quantitative risk assessment and modeling that OSHA engages in, again, is done by outside contractors generally for the PEL proposals. It is lengthy. It is expensive. They're looking at various alternatives to the quantitative risk assessment modeling, formalistic modeling program that they engage in or process they engage in now. They're looking to the EU that does benchmarking sort of risk assessments that don't take nearly as long, are not nearly as complicated, and are generally pretty accurate. They're looking at some EPA modeling, again, that's much simpler than they do under their PEL process. And very interesting, they're looking at the concept of using empirical data to support their determination of risk. Right now, OSHA models risk, but they're asking themselves a good question, I think, which is, wouldn't real data be able to tell us, at least in some instances, whether there is risk or not? It's a fascinating concept, and I encourage the agency to continue to look at whether they can use empirical data, and industry as well could use empirical data to show the absence of risk. Obviously, you'd have to have a robust data set, but some chemicals and in some industries, there are robust data sets that could be relied on to prove absence of risk or risk. So those things are all being considered by the agency. I want to talk about an action OSHA took in October of 2013. As I mentioned earlier, OSHA lists their PELs in Table Z. That's 1910-1000 Table Z tables 1, 2, and 3. The agency took an interesting, made an interesting action in 2013 by annotating their Table Z limits. On their website, they uploaded an annotated table where they include the chemicals that are listed in Table Z and the OSHA PEL. Those are the first two columns on this table that I've included on this slide. Then they added the California occupational exposure limits, the NIOSH, REL, and the ACGIH threshold limit values. So they've got OSHA limits, which tend to be lower, NIOSH limits, and ACGIH limits. Almost across the board, those limits are significantly lower than OSHA PELs. I pulled out just one example or just one chemical to give you an example. Total chromium, the PEL for total chromium is 5 milligrams per meter cubed. The Cal OEL is 1 milligram, the NIOSH REL is 0.5, and the ACGIH TLV is 0.01. The big question that everyone is wondering about is, what will the annotated table be used for? There's a lot of concern on industry side that the annotated table will be used to bring a general duty clause, a Section 5A1 general duty clause enforcement action. And OSHA has, in fact, brought at least one of these cases. I have an example in Wisconsin of Fiberdome, an employer that engaged in activities where his employees were exposed to styrene. The PEL for styrene is set at 100 parts per million. Employee exposures at Fiberdome that were measured by OSHA in an inspection topped out at 65.2 parts per million, well below the OSHA PEL. The NIOSH REL for styrene is 50. OSHA issued a general duty clause citation to Fiberdome for exposing their workers to styrene. $49,000 fine. Ultimately, the case was settled for a couple of $1,000s. But that action startled a lot of employers who are complying with the PEL, but whose employees' exposures are over a number of the limits that are on the annotated table. Now, OSHA has represented that it's the inclusion or the uploading of the annotated table, not the commencement of some campaign to use the general duty clause to enforce non-regulatory, voluntary, or recommended limits. However, I suppose the jury's still out. I do think that the agency, I do not know of another case other than the Fiberdome case. There may be another one out there, but there certainly are not many. The table's been uploaded since 2013. So we don't know where the agency's going with it, but we have to keep a watch out. This is one of the ways OSHA may consider avoiding the PEL process. They don't need the PEL process if they can use the general duty clause to require employers to comply with lower levels. So we'll just have to watch that. Now, on the non-PEL process side, OSHA is considering a number of very, very interesting tools, if you will, to help employers control exposures in the workplace or to regulate how chemicals exist in the workplace and what exposures are without establishing further PELs. One of the processes that I want to talk about because we're well over our hour and we're close to the point when I think we said we'd cut off. Let me talk at least about two alternatives that OSHA is considering. One alternative is called hazard or control banding. This is a process whereby rather than look at a specific hazard or set of hazards associated with a particular chemical and then develop specific controls to reduce exposures to that chemical, OSHA is looking at hazard banding where they group similar sets of chemicals or chemicals that have similar hazard characteristics into bands. And of course, this concept is the basis for OSHA's hazard communication revision to comply with, to render it consistent with GHS. OSHA has developed in GHS, HAZCOM's revision, a standard whereby chemicals are categorized and then classified according to hazards, classes of hazards. OSHA is considering and asking for comment on using the concept that you see in GHS, revised HAZCOM, in establishing hazards and controls for those hazards in the context of regulatory limits. So they band together similar chemicals with similar hazard characteristics, and then they develop control measures based on those hazard bands rather than based on a specific single chemical. It's a fascinating concept. It's a concept that seems to be being adopted in some, or supported at least by EU regulatory concepts such as REACH, for instance. And NIOSH is in the process of validating a proposed occupational exposure banding approach. OSHA is talking about relying on NIOSH's banding approach to adopt into some sort of regulation where we will see banded chemicals and banded controls rather than specific PELs. In addition, OSHA is looking at the concept of and encouraging informed substitution. As those of you who have worked with the agency in rulemakings realize, OSHA encourages substitution to avoid hazardous chemicals. They have now developed a toolkit to discuss how a company or how an industry can look for substitutes for its chemicals. Now, this isn't going to work across the board, but there may be certain situations, certain chemicals that can be replaced with less hazardous chemicals. And OSHA has developed a 7-step process in a toolkit that they've put online. I think you've got the site for it on the screen in front of you. Basically, the agency is encouraging the development of an expert team within the workplace to identify, inventory, and prioritize the currently existing chemicals to which employees are exposed. They then look to that team to do an assessment and comparison to chemicals that may have less hazardous, and then actually test out those alternative chemicals, evaluate them, and see which can be substituted. I'd encourage looking at their toolkit to see if it might be useful in your workplace. Finally, I just want to conclude by pointing out that I think, as I said earlier, everyone recognizes the system is broken. What we don't know is how to fix it. But OSHA's effort here, I don't think should be met with skepticism, as much as a recognition that they're open to different approaches. I think this is an opportunity for industry to comment on the processes that OSHA is considering or submitting new ideas of us, are regulating, are controlling, effectively controlling our hazards in the workplace. And we're doing that voluntarily with our own programs. Those programs might serve as the basis for a regulatory approach. The comment period OSHA created for this rulemaking is long, 180 days. It's open through April of 2015. So there's plenty of time left to comment. I'd encourage providing information to OSHA to help move us to a better regulatory approach that is not bogged down, that is not unfair, and that works better for employees, employers, and the agency. We have, I think, a number of questions. Please feel free to send questions in. As Eric said at the outset, since we're running past the time we promised to conclude, I'm not sure we're going to have time to do much questions. Let me just see if I can access some here. We promise we will get back to you either by calling you or providing you an email with answers to your questions. With that, why don't we conclude? We look forward to continued discussion with you on both chemical rulemaking, on the national enforcement programs that exist that we discussed earlier, and generally how to control chemicals in the workplace. Thank you very much.